Today, user interfaces are built to be invisible. We expect our intent to translate into action without a second thought. But in the 1970s, playing an interactive game required fighting a war of communication against the machine itself. This was the era of the text parser. In Colossal Cave Adventure, your mind rendered the world, but progression relied on guessing the computer's vocabulary. You might think of 10 ways to pick up a lamp, but the machine accepts only one specific phrase. This shifted the burden of play. Instead of navigating a narrative or outsmarting a villain, you spent your time solving a puzzle of syntax. The adventure genre had successfully arrived, but its stories remained locked behind an unforgiving linguistic wall. In the late 1970s, Roberta and Ken Williams of Sierra Online set out to fix this. They wanted to translate those text-based caves into visible environments using the hardware available on early consumer PCs, like the Apple II. Mystery House in 1980 and King's Quest in 1984 introduced vector graphics to the genre. These mathematical line drawings allowed players to see 16-color animated protagonists move through a physical space for the first time. However, this hybrid era had a critical flaw. While the visual feedback was now immediate, the players still had to manually type every command to interact with the art. There was a distinct disconnect in watching a living, animated world while being physically restricted to a command line interface. Ultimately, generating a visible world proved insufficient as long as the player lacked an organic way to touch it. Interaction only truly changed with the arrival of a physical bridge between the player and the machine, the computer mouse. Ron Gilbert and the team at LucasArts recognized this potential, developing the SCUM engine specifically for their 1987 title, Maniac Mansion. This schematic shows the engine's verb-object interface. Visuals on top, a grid of clickable actions and inventory items below. Typing was eradicated. By clicking a verb, then an object on screen, players could construct sentences and execute actions instantly. The mouse removed the friction of communication. Players could finally stop fighting the interface and focus entirely on the puzzles and the story. Once the mouse perfected the interface, a philosophical war erupted between Sierra and LucasArts regarding the core relationship between the developer and the player. Sierra operated on a philosophy often called designed suffering. Their games favored high stakes and realism, where a single misstep or picking up the wrong object resulted in sudden death. This logic tree illustrates the dead end. Missing a minor item early meant playing for hours before realizing the game was mathematically impossible. Ron Gilbert's LucasArts manifesto argued against this. In his games, every branch safely reconnected to the path of progression. This led to the LucasArts no-death rule. Without the fear of a game-ending mistake, developers could build puzzles based on humor, lateral logic, and wild exploration. In the mid-1990s, point-and-click adventures were the primary drivers of the PC market, often used to showcase the limits of new home computing hardware. This entirely new storage medium allowed for 650 megabytes of data, hundreds of times more than a standard floppy disk. Developers used that space to build pre-rendered, high-resolution worlds. In 1993, Myst utilized this immense capacity to sell over 6 million copies, a record it held for 7 years. While some focused on 3D environments, others perfected 2D animation. Titles featured hand-drawn cartoon styles and dynamic orchestral scores that rivaled animated films. These games represented the highest production values in the industry. But despite these technical and commercial heights, the genre's market share was about to vanish. The shift started with a technical pivot toward real-time 3D action. New hardware allowed for fast, aggressive movement in first-person environments. The thrill of real-time combat began to outweigh the appeal of slow-paced exploration. Compared to the instant feedback of a shooter, the traditional adventure felt slow. Players grew frustrated with hunting for tiny objects on a screen, or navigating puzzles based on convoluted moon logic. As 3D action became the new industry standard, the once dominant adventure game was sidelined as a relic of a slower era. The industry's exit from the genre is best illustrated by the 1998 release of Grim Fandango. LucasArts adapted by moving away from 2D backgrounds. They built characters as 3D polygons, allowing for cinematic camera angles. The results were a critical success. Reviewers gave near-perfect scores, praising the leap into 3D environments and the narrative depth. But those reviews didn't move copies. The game was a commercial failure, selling only about 500,000 units. Following these numbers, LucasArts and other major developers stopped production on original adventure titles. The genre was officially labeled as financially unfeasible for the mainstream market. High production values and critical acclaim were no longer enough to secure a retail release. The economic reality of the 3D era had pushed the adventure game out. For the next decade, the genre effectively disappeared from the catalogs of major publishers. Survival happened in the margins. Amateur developers created their own tools, while open-source projects like ScumVM allowed fans to keep 20-year-old games running on modern computers. This grassroots support kept the genre's design principles alive, while the rest of the industry focused on different formats. The path back to the mainstream began in 2012, when veteran designer Tim Schafer took an unconventional approach to funding. Since publishers claimed there was no audience for these games, Schafer appealed directly to fans through Kickstarter, asking for $400,000 to bypass the traditional gatekeepers. The response was immediate. The campaign didn't just meet its goal, it tripled it in hours, eventually raising over $3.3 million. Digital distribution platforms like Steam further changed the math. Without the cost of physical discs and retail shelf space, indie developers could suddenly afford to make games for a niche audience. Meanwhile, new hardware like tablets offered a natural fit for the old mechanics. A touchscreen provided the same precision as a mouse, making the interface accessible for a new generation. By combining direct fan funding with digital storefronts, creators were able to ignore the financial barriers that had originally marginalized the genre. But the revived genre didn't just replicate the past, it adjusted its core design to reach a broader audience. Studios began removing the high-friction elements of the 90s. They phased out complex inventory puzzles, cut tedious pixel hunting, in favor of smoother progression. These mechanics were replaced with branching dialogue and moral choices. This shift gave rise to the interactive drama, where the player's agency affects the plot rather than just the puzzles. The point-and-click adventure survived by shifting focus from environmental riddles to character-driven choice.